Avi Meyers, Northtown Neighborhood News Magazine, and want to thank Sonny, even though he's actually not here right now. He's run off, but we've got the cameras set up. We've got him going. It is a pleasure to introduce you to the person that I backed in Jewish Chicago and the person that I voted for Congress. And you know what? Just because somebody loses doesn't mean that we're not going to continue a conversation and not talk to them, and whether it's the election, future, whatever else. It is a pleasure to introduce all of you to somebody that I've grown to like very much over the course of the campaign, Joe Pollak. Joe, how you doing?
Nice to see you, Avi.
Good. How are you feeling?
Great. I'm very proud of what we accomplished and very pleased and optimistic about the future of our country. Obviously, there's a lot to do, but with Republicans in control of the House of Representatives, I think we're starting to move on the right track.
So yeah, you can't be too sorry about picking up about 64 seats or so.
Yeah.
So in any event, you know, no one ever got close to the amount of votes you got, and in many ways you were in an impossible race in an impossible district, where they basically threw every single, you know, far left wing area into this district that they possibly could to avoid the other districts from having to deal with that.
I'm not sure it was an impossible race. It was certainly a long shot race,
Yeah.
but what happened, and Jeff Schoenberg has said as much recently, is that they pulled in all of their resources to defend the 9th district seat, which meant that Republicans were able to pick up the 10th and the 8th and to do well elsewhere in the 11th and 17th. And the Evanston Democratic Party in particular, which had previously been able to deploy people all over the state and into neighboring states, didn't do that this time. They kept everybody home. Jeff Schoenberg called it the stay-at-home strategy, and I think if they run the stay-at-home strategy next time, we'll do just fine as well.
Okay. Well, very good. So what are your plans right now?
Well, we're going to take a look at what the future looks like. Obviously, with redistricting, that's something we have to take into account.
Well, that'll be big.
Yeah. But there's a lot to do. There's a lot of important things. Our district really did get very excited about the choice. Our volunteers are hugely motivated, and people want to continue doing what we're doing, talking about the issues we're talking about, making sure that we hold elected officials to account, and I think that's very important.
No, there's no question about it. You're going to have to go out and get a job now.
Return to the workforce, yeah, absolutely. That's very important, and just get going on the rest of our lives and see what happens next. Political office is something that our founders never intended to be a lifelong career or obsession, and there's much more good, I believe, that you can do by working in the community, contributing to the community, creating jobs for others. Obviously, political leadership is very important, and the direction that we've set, I think, is one we should continue in. But yeah, making a living is very important as well. So.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny. Until the last few years, I was never for term limits. I figured the voters should do the term limits. But when I see seniority and I see the way people keep not just entrenching themselves, but re-entrenching themselves, building a bigger moat for their own seniority and for the power of the leaders, and not just in Congress, but you know, here in the state of Illinois and in you know, between Madigan and Culleton and all that, I'm starting to think the term limits may not be a bad idea.
I support term limits, and I think that Congress ought to take another look at them. I think the vast majority of the American people support term limits because of the bad incentives that currently exist in our system to encourage lifelong members of Congress, if you will, to enrich themselves. I mean, how did people like Harry Reid become so wealthy? It's really a question of the legitimacy of our democracy at this stage, and I do think, although we have some very good leaders who are capable enough to stick around and so forth, I think that all the bad incentives are there to encourage leaders to entrench themselves. We're not going to see a big fight over earmarks among House Republicans and Senate Republicans trying to figure out whether we're actually going to finally get rid of the corrupt earmark system or not. And that's one of the ways in which citizens, I think, are cheated by the seniority system as it exists and by the longevity of congressional careers. It just shouldn't be that way.
No, very much so. And I'm very pleased to see. There's certain committee chairmen in particular I'm very pleased to see no longer there.
I think there are some other committee chairmen that are very exciting. I think that to have Ileana Ros-Lehtinen in charge of the Foreign Affairs Committee is very good for people who are very pro-Israel. She's the most pro-Israel member of Congress. Paul Ryan on top of the Budget Committee is great news for getting our fiscal house in order. And I think probably the best news that we have is that although Democrats won the governorships in California, Illinois, and New York, the most highly indebted states, you're going to have Republicans controlling the purse strings in Congress and basically saying, we're not bailing you out. The bailouts are over, and you guys have to figure out how to sort out the mess that you made. And in many cases, it is Democratic administrations at the state level that made the kinds of heavy deficit, heavy spending decisions that now they're going to have to undo. And I think it's, in a way, fitting and politically useful to have Democrats explain to their own constituencies why these spending cuts have to happen, why we have to get our house in order. There are no more bailouts coming from the federal government. And if they do come, they're attached with severe, stringent conditions. So I think there's a kind of, not just poetic justice, but there's a kind of political accountability that's finally coming to the system at many levels. Americans voted for divided government. We got our own version of the liberal Democrat conservative coalition that exists in Britain right now, where you have the conservatives leading the direction and liberal Democrats kind of coming along with a lot of these budget cuts. The beauty of our federal system is that we can have different things happening at the federal and state level. So I think it's good for the country's national security that Republicans are there to vote on the most important priority of the federal government, which is defense spending. And I think that Republicans will make sure that our country remains militarily strong while at the same time getting our financial house in order by looking at the other lower priorities on the list and seeing what we can afford and what we can't. I think it's very good to put that responsibility back onto the states to decide what their priorities are going to be. And it's going to be a rough ride economically and fiscally for the next 2 to 3 years, but I'm very confident that with the right leadership in place, the right determination, the right consistent opposition from groups like our campaign and other groups in the area to keep that fiscal responsibility on the front burner, I think we'll see a recovery begin in a serious way over the next 4 to 5 years. I'm very hopeful about that.
One of the things I got to say, and I do want to talk about your campaign a little bit, I've never seen that much energy in a campaign around here in a long time. And when I'd go to various places, there'd be a little old lady who maybe at some point was out there for a Democratic candidate because of the Jewish connection with the Democrats over the years, who's begun to understand that there are failing points right now within, and I don't mean this is a blanket statement all the way, but there's no question that the Republicans have been much more friendly toward Israel. As a matter of fact, one of the people who was here at an earlier part of the shoot today wants to get me a book about J Street and try to convince me, a non-Jewish person, that it's not quite the evil that I feel it. There's no question about it. It's not they're anti-Israel. And just because it says Jewish and they say we're pro something, it doesn't mean they are.
Well, I would ask them what the substance of their pro-Israel support is. You don't see any Israeli flags on the J Street website. If you go to the J Street conference, we sent a researcher to go see what was going on there. No identification with anything positive about the state of Israel. It's people who identify with Israel by criticizing it. That's not necessarily anti-Israel, but it certainly doesn't express any kind of, in my view, any sincere identification with what Israel's mission is, what Israel's accomplishments are. You go into an AIPAC conference, it's entirely different. Pictures of Israeli leaders, stories about Israeli achievements. There's a positive warmth between Americans and Israelis at an AIPAC conference. J Street is entirely the opposite. There's a kind of deadpan, critical posture that's taken solely for the sake of taking that critical posture. I think J Street has also got a track record of dishonesty about its funding, and
extremely dishonest.
I wouldn't take anything they say without a very, very large grain of salt. If
I know their executive director in Chicago. It's funny because his wife was on Check Please, and she picked her favorite restaurant is a Palestinian restaurant on, I believe it was on Chicago Avenue, but somewhere in that area. And I said to him, it's like, it was off the air. It's like, huh? And he says to me, well, I don't think we're going to agree about Israel.
Well, there's no accounting for taste, but I think there is accounting for...
I mean, the food might be delicious, I wouldn't know.
There is accounting for how you raise your money, who you get it from, and what you tell the public. And they were telling the public that they weren't getting funding from George Soros or from foreign donors and so on. And that turns out to have been a complete lie. So I think that...
Yeah, he's their main backer.
He is one of their main backers. I think $750,000 from the Soros family, and one year they got, I think, half their operating budget from someone in Hong Kong and so forth. And it's the kind of dishonesty, I think, that runs right throughout their critique of Israel. And I think that, again, it's often people who aren't informed, want to identify with some positive way in the Jewish community, and they take this identity, which is solely a critical identity, not a positive identification, and that becomes their identity. And I think that's tragic in a way. And I think J Street's done a lot of damage, but I think also they had a very bad night last Tuesday night in the elections. They
did.
They lost Joe Sestak in Pennsylvania. They also suffered losses in Florida, which were very important. Our district really led the way in terms of the critique of J Street and what they're about. And I think people in J Street can play a role in the debate. I just think they need to be a little less sensitive about how they're described when the truth about their positions and their history is told.
At this point, as much as I'd like to talk to you longer, I've got to leave room for all the other guests. I want to thank you very much, Joel Pollak. And hey, I hope you stay in the game because you've got something very important to
Thanks
say.
so much, Avi. Take care.
Thank you, Joe.